Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this week's Inspiring Leadership podcast. I know a lot of you enjoyed Captain Jim Hutton, ex-Royal Marines, and Jim's inspiring leader that he recommended was Rob Metcalfe, who joins us now from Australia. And I'm very grateful to him for making this time, as it's morning for me and it's the other time of the day for Rob. Rob has had a fascinating career. He's going to talk more about it later on. But, being in close observation platoons in South Armagh, being in the Falklands during the war there, with working with 5 Airborne, which was a fascinating time with Sir Peter Wall, a whole variety of different jobs. And also now leadership it's always remained his big things. Could be talking about proactive versus reactive leadership, and also the support he gives to the World Food Programme in dodgy places like Somalia and Iraq and the kind of places that, and talking about Syria, that you wouldn't want to go, but he's been to some very interesting places. Without further ado, Rob, welcome. Tell us a bit about what you're doing right now.
Yeah, thanks so much indeed. I'm just preparing to go off on a World Food Programme adventure, but delighted to be here with you, Jonathan. I'm at a stage of life where I'm able to, and I'll use this expression later on probably, but I'm able to do whatever I want, but know what I'm doing. Whereas for early life, I did whatever I wanted, but I had no real idea what I was doing.
I like that one. I haven't come across that one.
Well, I'm in a place, I stole it, by the way. It's not my original thinking. So at the moment, I've got a lovely way of life. I'm helping support somebody who I mentored a little bit when he was a bit younger, who won a large contract with the World Food Programme. So I spend a significant amount of my time with that organisation supporting him. It gives me great pleasure. I also have a small influence over the 2 organisations that span off out of an organisation I founded in 1995 and retired as the CEO, I think, in 2014, so some time ago now. So I'm one of those lucky people who kind of pleases myself what I do, but has maintained my interests in those organisations that I founded, and loving my contacts with the Royal Marines, which I had the recent opportunity to reacquaint myself with them and others, because I've been living in the UK for the last 3 years. Recently to Australia.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, it is interesting. The Royal Marines has been a big part of your life, those 14 years. It's sort of a number of the guests that I've had, whether it's Parachute Regiment, Royal Marines, SAS, or Navy SEALs, that the impact of being in an elite force does have a long-lasting positive impact, as well as when you've seen some shocking stuff that comes back, as we'll talk about later on in health and well-being. But what do you think was the big thing, having been a Royal Marine officer? What was the big thing that stays with you now as you teach leadership? Maybe you want to talk about proactive versus reactive leadership as well, but what was it that superb selection and training taught you that you still use now, Rob?
Yeah, look, I think many things. The belief I have, and I think the world is now ready for it, which is an important point. It wasn't really ready for it when we first started talking about it in 1995. Is what would you call leadership at every level is a simple way of explaining it. So I think what we were blissfully unaware of at every level in the Royal Marines was that we were able to lead ourselves in spite of the way in which we were led. So in other words, if your boss was not particularly good, then the system of leadership enabled one to step in, and somebody would be able to make to follow the battle procedure that meant, in spite of the way in which you're led, then you can still lead yourself and get yourself, seize the moment at every level, at every rank. So I spend my life trying to introduce a system of leadership to organizations that enables that, whilst fully developing the individual. So for me, it's a bit of a paradox. It's how do you have the doing element, which we command? There is no option. We do leadership this way, with simple tools and simple models. Yet for you as an individual, we want you to flourish and we really want you to develop. And I think the Marines was just fabulous in doing that. That's a kind of macro view. Mm-hmm. But the micro, I think anybody who finds themselves in extreme circumstances learns to love in a quite different way to the conventional meaning of love. So I recently met my troop that I worked with in Falklands, and there was a deep bond there that came out of that experience and all the experiences we'd had together that preceded it. And I think I've seen the same thing with the mining communities in Australia. I've seen the same thing with small groups of people who work on difficult things together, become intimate in a way that is difficult to mimic if you don't have similar circumstances to forge it.
Yeah, and I'm right in thinking that you were with the headquarter and signal squadron during the Falklands War. What were the inspiring leaders who really stood out for you? What qualities did they have, and did they show in time of war? And everybody sort of imagines that everybody involved in the military must be really great, but there are some poor leaders, and without naming them, what did the worst leaders do that you'd say do not do what they did? What stuck in your mind about the good and the bad?
Yeah, interesting question. So there was certainly the ability to think. Now, not a trivial point. So I'll share an equation which came out of a book by a guy called Vern Harnish, Scaling Up. Stimulus equals response is the way most people operate, and it's probably the way I was operating. So, for example, middle of the night on the top of Mount Kent, what we thought was artillery fire came in. It turned out later that it wasn't artillery fire. The weather was just so awful you couldn't differentiate between artillery and a bomb that's just been dropped out of the back of a Hercules. So I had a stimulus and a response. So I went sprinting off to a CP, and I informed people that a bomb had just landed very close to us. And the question, the response was pretty much, well, I heard it. So what? And I thought, well, really good. I've just moved my guns forward to the forward slope of the position. That's what we needed to do. But there was the ability to have that same stimulus that I'd received, but it was between the stimulus and the response from that individual, there was a pause. There was some thinking. And in that thinking lies freedom. So very difficult to do under circumstances of extreme hardship, which they were. I mean, it was cold, it was wet, it had been for many days, if not weeks at that point. But I thought it was just a very interesting piece of leadership on reflection to see somebody who is able to think when clearly I was just responding. I was being reactive. That's a good example, and there were many, many, many. I watched Brigadier Thompson, as he then was.
What was he like?
He was lovely. He just, I mean, genuinely lovely, always calm, never saw him riled, fully capable of taking command, but very, very human. And my job was to surround all of his CPs, all of his command posts, and all of his rebroadcast stations, and to protect him. And he was appreciative, very appreciative of all of that. But the ability to think, always thinking, making decisions because of that I think proved later on to be highly rational and very effective. On the other side, there was one example where I'd already lost a little bit of faith, and no names, no pack drill. But I went into a meeting, just a one-on-one meeting, turned out to be a two-on-one meeting, and two people were drinking a bottle of scotch that they'd acquired from somewhere. These are commanders, and it clearly wasn't, it wasn't a full bottle of scotch. I'd that less myself as a young troop commander returning from Ireland to say, keep your distance. But that was a pretty shameful example of conduct when it just simply wasn't available to anybody else, and wholly inappropriate to do that. And didn't lose respect for that person briefly. I lost it pretty well permanently. Small things, small signals that we send that are inconsistent with what's expected that show your values.
It's exactly that, Rob. And one of the leaders I worked with had a little mnemonic TNT, and they said it's the tiny noticeable things. And they were tiny noticeable things, but they made a massive difference. And the message they sent, please do use it. I shamelessly use it. It was one of the board members at ASDA. It's just, what are the tiny noticeable things that the signals you give out that really stay with people? Now, also, I'm fascinated with every guest I have, with kind of the inspiring leaders that you want to mention. I think we briefly talked about General Sir Peter Wall and Andy Keeling, but it might be others. But who would be the ones that you'd want to call out that you think should share their story and are very inspiring, you find?
Yeah, look, I think we have inspiring moments, don't we? And it's hard to experience the whole of somebody's leadership. So I'm just going to talk about moments that I found very inspiring from various people. I won't start off with either of the people you mentioned. I'm going to start off with a lady called Sheena Porter.
Mm-hmm. I know
So
Sheena.
14 years, and Sheena was my boss and owner, co-owner of a business then known as the Oxford Training, became later on the Oxford Group. And she inspired me with the following words on day one. She said, "Rob, my job is to liberate you of me as fast as possible." And I thought, that's an interesting way to start a meeting. And she might deny even saying that, but I can promise you that she did. And she said, the way I'm going to do that is to ask you questions. And I will always ask you the same questions. And the questions are these: what are you trying to achieve and why? What is happening right now? What are the facts? And what are you going to do about it? Well, those three questions formed the basis of my philosophy of leadership, even though it was deeply embedded in military thinking as well. Nobody had put it so simply before. Lo and behold, in meeting two, she asked me those questions, having agreed our objectives in the first meeting, and I was working pretty hard to answer those questions. And very quickly learned that the expectation was that I answered those questions before I walked into the room. Hence my desire to say you can lead in spite of the way in which you are led if you ask the right questions of yourself, not by accident, but as a deliberate practice. Consciously or subconsciously, I think that's what that guy, when the bomb dropped, would have been doing. And that is what General Thompson was doing all the time. What are we trying to achieve and why are we trying to achieve it?
So just for those listening and for my benefit as well, I like that, Rob. What are you trying to achieve and why? And then at the end, what are you going to do about it? What was there was another one, a third question.
Where are you now? So where are you now?
Where are you now?
Yeah, what are the facts? So one of Sheena's little expressions was be tough on the facts and open on the reasons. Be tough on the facts, open on the reasons. Was it a bomb? Was it a piece of expenditure you needed to expend? So part of what she did was that. And then she did it. So there's a lot of leadership in there. She said, this is what I'm going to do. And then she consistently did it. But she told me what she was going to do. It was a social contract. Which brings me on a little bit to Andy Keeling. So Andy Keeling, wonderful, wonderful person who fully empowered me, not in the same way that Sheena. He sent me off, he separated me from the unit, sent me off to South Armagh to do something completely different to what the unit in Belfast was doing, which was a sign of great trust. But the social contract he put in place with me when I first started the job, for which I was not qualified, by the way, I was selected because somebody else didn't get there, somebody else dear to both of us. So I was kind of in this job by default. And he said, Rob, you are my expert and I will always take your advice, apart from when I do not take your advice. He said, the reasons for that are that I'll know more than you do, and I'll be in a position to make a decision that you can't possibly make. But I will always come back and explain why when I've got the time. And that's exactly what he did. So in both of those examples, they're being proactive in telling me how they're going to behave, and then they behave exactly how they say they're going to behave.
This is your proactive versus reactive leadership, isn't it?
Well, it's part of it, yeah. I mean, my experience with organizations has been, not recently, throughout my time with them, that I observed people interpreting leadership as a reactive pastime. So what makes people successful as junior leaders is probably more reactive by virtue of the job that they do than proactive. But the more senior we get, the more I would pay people to sit in the corner and have a quiet think about what they were going to do next. By dint of our experience and the organizational design and the circumstances in which we find ourselves, I think people are reacting to circumstances as opposed to shaping the future. So I love that expression the Americans use about shaping the battlefield. People are often, in my experience, being shaped by the battlefield in reaction. Social contracting is one way to avoid that. Doing what you say you're going to do. So that's about the relationship. This is how our relationship will be. What do you expect? What do I expect? How do we want it to be? And then what are we actually trying to achieve task-wise? And they're quite different things.
Really interesting. And I love, you've mentioned it a few times now, the this idea of the social contract. Sheena, who I have met, and a very impressive lady. But also I think of Richard Dannett, Lord Dannett now, as my commanding officer. He was very keen on the psychological contract with people, and also the military covenant, that we're going to go to Iraq, Afghanistan, wherever it might be. We're going to fight for the country and the protection of the country and doing what the government wants us to do. But you've got to look after us, our families and our men and women, when they get injured and they lose legs or limbs or get killed. Look after us in return. That's all we ask in this covenant. And I think all too often people don't keep the social contract, the psychological contract, or the covenant. I don't know what your thoughts are.
Yes, I don't think we exercise the muscle to be able to keep it because we haven't often had the conversation in the first place. So I speak to people about this idea of a social contract, and at best people remember from school or university the social contract being something the government agrees with its people. It's not something I agree with my people. So the whole idea becoming more popular now of having a team charter that everybody signs on to, which includes the why, the how, and the what. Why do we exist? Purpose. What are we here to? Sorry, how are we going to behave? Values, and what are we actually doing? And agree all that up front. But that can be done at the individual level. It can be done at the organizational level. It can be done at the cross-organizational level, the cross-international level. So my interest really is in really ensuring we get the most senior people possible with the biggest impact possible doing these things. Hence my preference for working with senior leadership teams in organizations. And when they do it, providing we keep it simple, it actually works. I can't believe that people actually pay me to talk about this stuff because it's so simple.
Well, yes, it's simple, but it's not easy. As someone equally
simple, but not simplistic.
Yeah. Everything should be as simple as possible, but no simpler. But I think it's simple, and you understand it, and you feel somewhat slightly guilty when you're being paid lots of money to do it. But I think the skills that you've learned over many years in combat and on operations and all the training allows it to make so much sense to you. They've probably invested in the 14 years in your time in the Royal Marines, probably about £500,000 in your development, easily. And yet in the businesses that you and I are working with, if they spend £10,000 on someone's development, they go, oh, it's a lot of money. Not sure we want to spend that kind of money. And so they go, well done, Rob, you're promoted into this new job. Get on and become the CEO. And you go, is there a 6-month, 12-month program? No, just get it, go and crack on. And so they go in there with very little help.
Yeah, I agree. I see it all the time. And of course, that induces the low level of threat we were talking about. And if we look at the neuroscience, we can prove it. This is what is happening in your brain when you say something this way to somebody and their brain versus saying this way to somebody. So for me, the protection lies in deeply helping people to understand what a practice is. So in the Marines, we didn't have the option. The practice was forced upon us. Yeah. Whereas how can we help people to understand that discipline is simply a habit and a routine? So if you want to learn something, you don't have to practice a difficult conversation whilst you're having a difficult conversation. Practice it in your head using simple tools. Practice it with somebody in a non-threatening thing. Simulate it, but do it once a week until it becomes subconsciously competent. So I think we can make people effective. Yeah,
no, that's really good. Well, you met very inspiring leaders. People find you, like Rob is. So Jim Hutton is an inspiring leader himself, and we were at Staff Course together, as you know. And he said, you're a truly inspiring leader, and you're inspiring others through the training and the development you're doing with them. And please keep up that work; it's essential. What's made you into the leader I and others are experienced today, Rob, as they listen to this podcast and they watch it on YouTube? Growing up, who were the kind of role models? Were parents, were the grandparents, were the teachers? Before you got into the Royal Marines, you must have been shaped a lot. Just give us a quick thumbnail in a few minutes of your life.
Yeah, look, I'll try and keep it brief, and I'll try and bring some values to the table as we go. So if we do go back slightly chronologically, not necessarily the right way to tell the story, but chronologically, I was born in a a mill village in Yorkshire, but my dad was the doctor, so I was the silver spoon in the mouth. He turned up
Which village? Which village?
Pool in Wharfdale is the village.
I know Pool in Wharfdale. I've been walking up in that area because I'm an Halifax lad, so Pool in Wharfdale I know well. Yes, yes.
Well, it's in the good old days. It was just a mill village supported by 2 council estates, very little other development going on. So I was the kind of wealthy doctor's son. Whether that was true or not remains to be seen. But I went to a grammar school. I went to Bradford Grammar School. With the start of the immigration movement into Bradford. So I played cricket with Indians and Pakistanis and Bengalis. But when I came back to the village, I was wearing my school uniform. So I had to learn to live and love and fight with the local youth. Now, why is that important? I think it's given me the greatest gift that anybody could give you, which is to be able to mix with people from all different backgrounds and be reasonably comfortable. I do occasionally get imposter syndrome myself, but mixing with all the different backgrounds, literally from one side of the river to the other side of the river. So that was part of it, which is a value today, which I really appreciate in terms of the diverse groups of people that I meet. Just one story about my dad, profound influence. I left home at 17, went to university and started getting letters from my dad. And I got a letter every week from my dad for the rest of his life.
Wow.
So he died a few years ago at the age of 88. The final letter arrived as he had his heart attack in the grounds of the cricket field. Perfect way to die. So what is the point of all of that? It's he invested very heavily, not only in me, I found out later he sent other people letters as well. So the only thing I wanted was his pen at the end of the end of his life, and I actually got his fountain pen, which turned out to be a gift that my mother had given him in 1950 something. So deeply, deeply moving, and I've kept the second half of those letters. But my assumption was everybody had a similarly loving family. They didn't.
No. Well, that is so interesting. And as you're saying that, I'm thinking to my 2 daughters who are now 29 and 30, and one's just got married a couple of weeks ago, and the other one's going to get married in 3 weeks' time. They've got lovely husband and fiance. And I was thinking, perhaps I should start writing letters. I mean, you have emails and you have texts, but it's lost. And we had a family reunion, the Perks family reunion, just this weekend. We do it about every 4 years or so. And Thomas Edgar Perks, my grandfather, killed in 1943 when his aircraft flew into a hillside where he was an inventor for the War Office on his way to see his son, who was 21 in the Royal Air Force as a pilot. And you want this information. Now you're older, we're at the stage where we're interested. When you're younger, you're not that interested. But when you're older, you really are. Thinking all these experiences you had, take yourself back to when you were 16 to 18 years old, Rob. What bit of advice would you give to the young Rob Metcalfe, which is suitable for others who've got, sons and daughters at this age? This matters, this doesn't. From your experience and all your life experience, what advice would you give to a young 16 to 18-year-old?
Look, I'd say, using that equation again, stimulus plus, who was it said it? Nietzsche said it, I think. He said, he wouldn't have used stimulus and response, but this was a sense of it. Between stimulus and response lies a gap, and in the gap lies freedom. So let me illustrate what I mean. I decided very wisely at the age of 16 to leave home and go and do something. To leave home, leave school, and go and become a police cadet, actually. And I said, that's what I'm going to do to my dad without really giving him the option. But all he did was ask a question. And in the question, he created a pause. And in that pause lay the freedom to not make the decision that I was about to make. But I made lots of stupid decisions on the way. For example, drinking after a game of cricket instead of going to bed the night before my English A level, which I was supposed to get an A in, and I really didn't get an A. And of course, those little moments change your life. So take that pause, but don't mollycoddle your kids. Let them do what they need. Let them do what they need to do, which I was very fortunate. I talk about values for a minute. You've just stimulated a thought in me. So I was talking to my son about this morning. So I was talking about values. And I've been guided by values that I know I've got, which were bred into me. But then later on in life, I said, well, how do I actually enjoy spending my time? And I really enjoy spending my time in things like the wilderness, which I was allowed to do as a child, which is where these thoughts just come from. So if I articulate wilderness as a value and then use it to guide some of my decision making, as a result of deciding that late in life, I flew my dad down to New Zealand and we went and walked the mountains in New Zealand. I would never have done that unless I'd thought, how do I really love spending my time? And I love spending my time in the wilderness, and my Marines career basically a wilderness career. So there's and my son raised another interesting point. So there are those values you don't even know you have. And in wartime, that's what you're going to find out about. So you realize that somewhere primeval is more values that will emerge under the right circumstances. So we talk in a trite way about values, but it's not trite.
No, it comes from your experiences. And in your experiences, if you look back, what's been one of your darkest moments, and what did you learn from that, Rob?
And look, some of them are external, some of them are internal. My external one is an obvious one. So I had a headache. I was about to fly to Papua New Guinea. I thought I better see the GP. I didn't have a GP. I went to the local health centre, described my symptoms, and she said, don't like it. So 1 hour later, I found out, well, I didn't find out, actually, it was a little bit after that, but I had a scan which revealed a brain tumor. I then was told you will have chemo, radio, you will probably not work again. And I pretty much thought that's it, because I'd seen the scan. I thought I'm going to die here. On the Tuesday, that was 3 days later, a doctor called Michael Biggs, neurosurgeon, took the tumor out. Proved to be benign, and I was fine. But in the moment, it was really interesting, because I kind of went through all the grieving process quite quickly. I then more or less said, people talk about fighting, and I thought, nah, that's it. What an interesting journey I've had. I'm banging out next week. I don't really have to worry anymore.
How long ago was that, Rob?
That was 2006. So touch wood, still.
And was it? Did they drill into your brain, or how did they do it?
Yeah, they do it through three little. Well, I don't know exactly how they did it, but face down, they operate on the back of your head, and I can still feel a little hole in my head here. They've got to extract the thing without actually bursting any blood vessels, because that's what causes damage. Anyway, they managed to do all of that. I do remember waking up and they asked me questions which might amuse you. They said, the three people in the room, what day is it? I said, Tuesday. Who's that? My daughter Sophie. Who's that? My daughter Kelly. And who's that? Pointing at my wife, I said, Mrs. Thatcher. Nobody really found that amusing, and she'll hate that I've told you that story.
And what was the other dark moment?
Look, the other dark moment is much more self-caused, based on fear-based decision-making. So shortly after that event, I was a little bit vulnerable at work. I lost a key player, a brilliant consultant who was one of the people that I really valued in the business and was very valuable for the business. So I thought, I'm not surviving. The business might not survive without this guy. So I made a wrong hiring decision. I hired another incredibly smart individual, but in my gut, there was a cultural misfit. But my fear-based decision-making, based on the survival of my business, said, no, we've got to do this. I've got to have some resource and people in place. It wasn't a fair decision to that person. It wasn't a fair decision to everybody else in the business. And it was a deeply fear-based decision that eventually caused a lot of damage to the business, to the individual concerned, and to me, and I'm scarred by it. So if I can help people to avoid fear-based decision-making, then that is a good legacy.
Yeah, it is interesting. And like you, I've made some fear-based decisions. And looking back, I can't believe how stupid I was, but I learned lots of experience from it. Was it Mark Twain who said, I think I'm going to make some more mistakes because I learned so much from those mistakes, the experience I gained. But I do see it in business a lot, that they're frightened of something. And it's like driving through a gap in a stone wall, and you go, I mustn't hit the pillar. And it apparently draws you towards it because you're focusing on the pillar. You actually, oh no, I've scraped the car. I said I wasn't going to do that. Well, let's go round. You've obviously developed various different models of leadership. There are many thousands of them, Rob. We found in the research, my wife Lee and I, that inspiring leadership's our theme. Obviously, it's of this podcast, and the 8 elements are interested just to hear your views. So, moral quotient, values is something you've talked about a lot in your upbringing. It's helped you in many a scrape. But what is your tip to people what did you do when you let your values slip, and how did you get yourself back on track to live your values?
Yeah, look, I don't know that we ever live them 100%, do we? So I was going to quote a little bit of Jim Collins, a book called Built to Last. He's more famous, I think, for Good to Great. But in Built to Last, he talks about the power of purpose and the permanence of your why. Why being purpose and values, and goals being more transitory. You can achieve your goals, but values and purpose remain the same. And we never achieve them. So you just change the balance of the amount of time you do spend achieving them. So I articulated a purpose around a legacy of leadership, which was our business purpose for a long time. And whenever we strayed away from that, we found ourselves coming back to it. And that, I think, is a great anchor point for anybody who's dealing with complex times. Know your purpose, know your values, know your why. I like to use little expressions that can change lives. And one of these was, are you on the planet to do something or for something to do? And I think if we can remind ourselves of that, that's great. So on days when I've had a bad day, I might have delivered something badly or had a bad interaction. Then I say to myself, pick up one more piece of litter than you drop every day. And if I haven't done anything else, then I get myself recentered, literally by picking up a piece of litter. And if we all did that, there is no more litter. So as a metaphor for how you want to leave any interaction, it's not a bad one.
I like that. I like that. And in fact, you've answered in some ways that because they're so closely aligned from your vision and your values, your moral quotient, to your purpose quotient, your meaning and purpose. And you've already talked about that. So I won't cover that one now, but let's talk about health and well-being. It's mattered deeply to you throughout your Royal Marine time. And you and I have talked about how we keep ourselves fit and healthy in our 60s. And this idea of having a health span that matches a lifespan. Sadly, my late mother-in-law, her lifespan, her health span ended about 10 years before her lifespan, and she had a lot of illness in the last 10 years of her life, which is what I aspire not to do. I hope I just a bit like your dad. The moment that he passed out in the cricket grounds, I just want to go like that, like, hell, what a ride. That's it. No, or it was, I think it was Blaster Bates, who was a demolition expert, and he said he wanted to climb one of his chimneys that he used to bring down and just press the detonator on it and blow the chimney up and go down with his own chimney. No long illness, but this whole area I know means a lot to you. Particularly with having the brain tumor and things like that, it brings it very front of mind. 2006. What's your tip about physical health and about mental health, brain health, particularly relevant, that you'd give to people listening? If there was a top tip you'd give on those two.
Yeah, look, I think on both fronts, always have an experiment running. Give you an example from a mental health point of view. Again, quite inspiring story. A friend of mine, another inspiring leader, my old boss, fell off a cliff, broke his back, had a bit of spinal column left, learned how to drove again, and eventually got himself a motorbike. Bear in mind, he has no feeling in his feet. And the next day I heard, he's come to Australia and he's driving his motorbike through the middle of the desert. So I thought, you know what? That is inspiring. I am going to run an experiment. My experiment was, I'm going to learn how to ride a motorbike. If I like it, I'll carry on. And if I don't, I won't. That was the experiment, which has resulted in an enormous amount of pleasure, but learning as well. I'm a much better driver for doing it. And I feel confident and fantastic that I've learned a new skill at the age of 65. And I'm quite sensible on the bike so far. So always have an experiment running, I think, is a great thing to do. My physical experiment at the moment, in addition to some quite deep disciplines, for example, Indian clubs. I do Indian clubs, which is just a mixture of coordination and weight, dating back a long way, historically quite interesting. But that started as an experiment, which I loved. I've carried on doing it. But the current experiment is based on Wim Hof,
Yes.
the cold water guy. So it's in the evening here in Australia. So in preparation for our meeting, I had a couple of minutes under a freezing cold shower to give myself the dopamine hit that I needed to give and I did some deep breathing as well. And
well done. Well, of course, before I came and joined you on this podcast, I took both my dogs, the Cocker Spaniels, for a run. I don't go too far these days because as we get into our 60s, we've got to watch the inflammation that comes from too much running over the years that we've done. But in later life, it ain't so good for us. So I just do a couple of miles, 3 or 4 Ks. But I came back and then I had the hot tub with my stepson. He's a police officer. He had some time off. The kids are at nursery. We're looking after them all. They're living with us for a year. But we just sat in the hot tub together, had a lovely chat. And then I went into the cold plunge. I've got this cold pod, but I can't make it quite cold enough. But I go from 40 degrees down to maybe 18 degrees. Now, that's not very cold, but there's that delta change, that cold difference. And I notice it. I feel it when I get in and I get the buzz from it and I'm raring to go. What's your advice from what you've researched about Wim Hof? Does it have to be ice floating in the thing to get the benefits? I don't think it does.
So. I did do a bit more research. There's a guy called Andrew Huberman who does a 3-hour podcast on all matters neurological, and he's done one specifically on cold water. And there's a lot of science behind it now. And his wisdom, I can't remember it exactly, so please don't take this as science, dear listener. But I think he says 11 minutes a week of cold water, and it doesn't have to be an ice bath.
No.
But it gives you the equivalent hit without any of the downside of the same amount of dopamine that you would get from a cocaine hit. So it does make you feel good, no doubt.
Oh, yeah, I'm buzzing.
Yeah, and the science.
So he was saying 11 minutes per week, not each time it has to be 11 minutes. It could be a couple of minutes. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And the advice is get out of the cold shower. Don't warm it up again before you get out. So
correct.
Self-warm.
Yes, exactly.
Anyway, apart from anything else, it's an experiment. It may not last, but it's fun, and it's interesting, and it sort of keeps us alive.
Okay.
I think, to be really serious for a minute there, I think my only ambition is I call it the purple line of peace. I occasionally do what we call a life map, and my goal at the end of the day is just to have peace of mind. And as a kid, I was kind of like this. And I am now sort of wavering, and hopefully by the time I have my car park event, whatever that looks like, maybe on a motorbike, I'll be at peace with the world.
Yeah.
And if you look at the free divers, if you look at the thing we were talking about earlier in terms of the deepest breath, that excellent Netflix documentary, they say the key to it is to be deeply peaceful.
I love that. Yeah, no, great. Thank you for that. Rob, the other one I was going to ask you, I interviewed Oscar Trimboli the other day, who wrote the book. It's just over my shoulder, but people can't see it on the podcast, which is How to Listen. What has been your skill, Rob, in learning how to listen?
Yeah, clear your head before you start. I think another quote from somebody wise who said, "The quieter I am, the more I hear." And again, quoting Sheena, she said, "Ask a question and do not be the next person to speak," was one of the pieces of wisdom she gave me. And the other one was ask a question and wait 6 seconds. So rather like a Royal Marines Bergen, we tend to fill it with stuff that you don't actually need. And I think the art of listening is about not filling the silence with stuff that you don't need. So learn how to ask great questions. They start with a W. Rudyard Kipling's 7 Honest Men, I think, what and why and how and who and where and when. So ask a question and shut up, I think, is the key. And then the skill of listening we can talk about, but actually the presence. I think if we can learn to be present, fully present, then we will notice things even when they're not being said. And when I failed to do that, it's cost me a lot of either social capital or financial capital, because I have picked up on the clues and the cues because my mind has not been quiet.
No, it's really great wisdom in what you've just said there, particularly Kipling's 6 Honest Serving Men and True. I tend to use that almost if I'm doing an offsite or something like that. I'll just run through those questions, and I've pretty much got the format of how to run an event for them. And I find that very helpful. The next one is we call CQ, Collaborative, Cultural and Cognitive Intelligence. It's almost like, how do you get on with people who are most different from you? And you've had lots of experience from your Asian colleagues playing sport with them when you're at Bradford Boys Grammar, which a lot of my friends went there, so I'm sure there might be an overlap. And also the boys in Poole in Wharfdale. So, and then Somalia and Iraq and everywhere else. How do you get on with people who are most different from you?
Yeah, look, I think the first thing is difference is mainly in our head. I think if we look at the science, we like people who are like us, don't we? That is what the science tells us. So if you understand that, then how can you help people to be more like us? Because my observation is over many, many years, and I wish I'd understood it earlier, is that basically we are all, regardless of religion, regardless of color, regardless of location, not quite regardless of age, but we have some areas of commonality. So if we take the time to connect, so for example, if I am running a program in Somalia, which I'll do, the first people into the room will get my undivided attention, regardless of the fact that I've got to start talking in a minute and a half's time, just to try and find that little bit of common ground. So I don't think people care how much you know until they know how much you care. So the authenticity with which you ask those questions about them and reveal vulnerably, confidently, but vulnerably reveal a bit about you, then you build that common ground. So we often get the feedback, myself and the Ugandan lady who is a particularly special facilitator, we get the feedback that people do not generally, in our role, display vulnerability. But as soon as we do, that trust is built. But the vulnerability has to be displayed confidently, not needily. So be prepared to say who you really are. Get your inner game on the outside for a change, and let people see it.
There's some real gems in there, but that last one, get your inner game on the outside, it is very true. And I'm just making a note now. The Inner Game of Tennis by Tim Galway. Tim's very old now, but I had a fascinating conversation with him about the inner game, which is all his book and his work. And a lot of people, Olympians and others, have taken his work from many years ago as a very important one. And also that truism that people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care, I think as a philosophy is really important. And funny enough, it was a newsletter I was just writing the other day, linked to the book Spies by Calder Walton, about being deceived at work and in business, and people spying, industrial espionage, but also the Soviets and the Chinese are doing massive amounts of spying in most of the European and American and Australian countries, and we're just not aware of just how much is going on. The paradox of, on the one hand, the likes of you and I are encouraging people to be open and to be appropriately vulnerable, not just throwing themselves on the ground and sobbing and banging their hands like some 4-year-old. I've seen a few examples of that with my 1 and 2-year-old as their grandchildren as they're here. But on the other hand, we've got to trust, but verify. We've got to put some process in place and 2 levels of authentication, all this kind of stuff, and be aware of your identity being stolen. How do you reckon we should get this paradox and live with it? On the one hand, being as open as you can be. On the other hand, don't be naive with your business or your military secrets. Well, what's your thoughts, Rob?
Yeah, look, I think the word paradox is an interesting word. Paradox and dilemma. So dilemmas cannot be addressed, but paradoxes can. So it's a bit like doing and being, isn't it? We can have a process, but we can also either follow it or not. There's a doing and a being element. So I would stand accused of being delightfully naive when it comes to people, because my assumption is always that people live on the good side. And my experience is, if we can have a contract that starts off with a W1, by that I mean what are we trying to achieve together and why? If we can agree that much, and we can agree the expectations we have of each other up the front, it very quickly becomes clear whether or not people are prepared to live by that, and their authenticity becomes revealed not by their current vulnerabilities, but by their initial commitment. So if we can work out a commitment to which we're both agreeing on, then I'm really happy to be vulnerable but not needy, because we learn from others' mistakes. Why would we bother to learn from our own when we can learn from other people's? So let's get the ground rules in place which minimize the amount of damage caused by my naivety, and following the process removes the effects of my personality, which are delightfully naive, I hope.
Well, I join you on that one. You run a lot of leadership events around the world for top teams. I'm always interested in, best practice and what goes on. And particularly, I've got about 5 offsites with teams around the world, and a couple in America, Portugal, Europe, London. What do you do to build trust between a CEO and a top executive team when it's pretty low? There's not the psychological safety, because maybe the CEO is the smartest man or woman in the room, and the others are constantly trying to impress them and second guess what the CEO is thinking. And they might say they're delegating and empowering and elevating people, but they still get involved in trying to solve their problems. What's a good technique you found to build trust, a practical exercise with a team?
Yeah, look, I think when I ask people in teams, particularly at the senior level, where the cost is high of answering questions honestly, and when you ask them why they exist as a team, they often don't know. So I think part of the answer is to say, well, let's really work out why we exist as a team. That's a practical exercise that can be run. I think the other bit that I picked up from, I can't remember the name of the book, but Wageman and Nunes, I think, were the people who wrote it. They said that real teams must do real work together. And if they do not do real work together, then there's no reason to be a team. And in the doing of that real work, real personalities evolve. The work that the teams do must be work that only that team can do. And so my experience is that they'll focus in on strategy, they might focus in on culture, but they must do it together. So if I wear the red shirt of sales through the week, then I need to put on my blue shirt with the rest of the executive team when I go into this meeting. And in doing that real work together, you soon find out who is who in the zoo, because the opportunity to pretend is no longer there. So that'd be my tip for teams. And so few of them are doing it. Most of the meetings that I come across that people have routinely in their normal cadence, they're not working meetings, they're reporting meetings. And people would rather be doing something else. So get them to do real work.
Yeah, I remember when I was a managing director in a PLC myself, and the old concept that my own team was the one I cared a lot about. We had a sense of purpose. We were all, in our case, we were all doing leadership coaching and board development. But I was really frustrated when I had to go and join the other 5 managing directors and report to the CEO and the CFO. And they would play us off against each other. And they'd go, well, Jonathan, last week you were a hero with your numbers. You've done really well. But this week you're a bit of a zero. But Graham, well done. This week you're the hero. Jonathan's a zero. And of course, then he goes, we'd like you to all collaborate and work together and, cross-sell. We're going, sod that, because you're going to compare us all. And we're put in a ranking depending on what we do. I've even known some executive search, big global firms, give work to a rival company because they know they're being ranked against them and their bonuses depend on the rank order they have. They'll give work away in another sector to somebody else rather than their own company in order that they because of the competition. So I really relate to what you say. Any thoughts that come up for you from that shocking story?
It's the whole philosophy of why do workplaces exist. So my thinking on my first company is I just want that to carry on forever because it's a great place for people to work. And if that's the premise upon which we set up a business, not just to make the profit we need to make to create the great place to work, but actually the reason we are here is to make it that place which everybody wants to be at. So I want that first business of mine to stay in existence forever because they do great work and they really they really do look after their people and develop them well. And it's a fantastic place to get the peace of mind we were talking about. If our premise is all about my profit, we end up, I don't know if you followed the case in the consulting world in Australia recently, where a massive scandal with one of the big consulting firms who were advising the government, but also on their tax policy, and then advising their clients how to avoid it. So the day the tax policy was released was the day that the clients put in their kind of counter strategy to counter the. So they were playing both ends off against the middle, and they got found out. And
they can't work in Australia anymore. I seem to remember the company. It's really sunk. It's really sunk. They had to close. I think they sold that consultancy for a penny, or the equivalent of a dollar.
Well, it's still playing out in the courts, so there's probably more than one example. But if that's the premise upon which we set up businesses for our personal aggrandizement, then I'm afraid that is not the business that I necessarily want to be supporting. So again, we have freedom of choice with who we work with.
I saw that with the investment banks and the CDO swaps and synthetic CDOs and all this AAA rated product they were selling, which was actually a pile of dung, and getting the rating agency giving them AAA scores, and everybody was just in this big game. They didn't care what they did as long as they sold as many mortgages as they could, even though they were subprime and the people would have no chance of paying them. There's a lot of people that I've come across who do that. So that's a bit of a shocker. We've just got a few more minutes left, Rob, but one other thought came up from what you said in those practical questions about why do we exist as a team, that I've come across some of these offsites where they have an offsite and I go, are you a team or are you a group? A team has a common purpose, as you're saying, this is why we're here, and we can do this task together. Or you're just a loose group because you happen to have a boss and you will report to her or to him. A number of them have said, we're just a group. We're not really a team. We don't have a common. And therefore, it makes it particularly hard to get them to see this team as their first team and their own team as their second team. And they go, well, I just, and this was what I had when I was in that consultancy, and that we were being played off against each other. I really just, my only focus was on my team. I'm ashamed about it. I didn't see playing to the bigger team and the bigger organization because we were just a loose group being played off against each other. Any thoughts from you, Rob, just before we move on?
Yeah, look, I think I don't actually mind people being a loose group, as long as they acknowledge it. So let's just not pretend to be a team if we don't need a team. We only need a team where there is common work to be done, which only we can do. Now we can either create that because we've been thoughtful enough to say this is going to be really useful, or we can not think about it hard enough and create something that is not useful. And of course, we then end up with clients, with compliance. So we turn up for meetings because we turn up for meetings. And I don't think it only goes to teams, it goes to processes. We invent a process, performance management processes are typical. And the process may be a good process, but it's not used. It's only used for compliance. So if we're just a team and we're complying, we're bound to end up with a vacuum of utility, which is filled by the things you're talking about, filled with not just useless, but things that take us backwards.
Yeah. So true. There's great wisdom in all that you're sharing. Thank you for this, Rob. Last couple of questions, then we'll do your top leadership tip. With that, this whole concept about teams and groups, and where they have a sense of purpose, and are they really committed to something? Are they fully all in, or are they just complying? Someone once said quite bluntly, you can't be a little bit pregnant. You're either full in or you're not, but you can't pretend you're halfway there. What about toxic teams or toxic individuals? What have you done personally as a leader, or what have you helped others to do when you've got an individual or a whole team that's gone toxic? How do you turn it around?
Yeah, look, I think what I've done sometimes, I've done very badly, but I have extracted the tooth. I think there's an important point to be made here about leadership, which is taking people to organizational objectives willingly, helping them to achieve organizational and personal objectives willingly, which is where some of the things we've talked about comes in. There is management, which comes from the French word maintenance, controlling, putting the systems and so on in place. But the forgotten art of command, sometimes seen as a dirty word, I think is an important thing to bring out here. So if I'm the boss and I have a toxic team, I'm saying, you're either in or you're out, but this is not a consensus-based decision. You need to be, and I don't mind if you don't turn up for the meetings, but if you do turn up, you've got to be present. So I think being prepared to take command of a situation is a part of leadership which we should not forget.
Yes.
Not just it's not just what you're entitled to do, it's what you're expected to do.
Yeah, I think as my old Sergeant Major bluntly said in good military speak, which you'd respect, but forgive the listeners, that, sir, this person, he's either inside the tent pissing out or he's outside the tent pissing in. But I think he's outside the tent pissing in, and I think we should do something about him. And it's a pretty grim analogy, but as you say, you've got to extract the tooth. And people, time and again, particularly CEOs, go, do you know what, looking back, I hung on too long in making the decision to remove them. I was trying to give them another chance, and I didn't want to upset them because he was a friend of mine. I've known him for 15 years, but actually I should have acted quickly. And I think someone told me that the old adage of be firm in the decision, be kind in the execution, how you help them find their happiness elsewhere.
Look, and I think there's a really important point to make, because done skillfully, with the right level of social capital created early enough, we understand what each of our team members is trying to achieve at the personal level with their life, with their career, and we've helped them to think that through. Now, almost certainly, if they're not performing well in any aspect of their job, whether it's to do with the team or elsewhere, they're not acting in their own interests. So we can give feedback that looks like, remember, this is what you told me you wanted. Well, in what way is that piece of behavior contributing to that? So there's a piece of that social capital where the interest is gathered at the point that it needs to be gathered, whether that's positive or otherwise. I think that's part of it. And then if we've got the skill to follow a process that looks like, here are the facts, why is this happening? I'm going to tell you I'm disappointed or whatever I'm feeling. I am now going to say, if this carries on, there will be consequences. I then exercise the consequences. That is not what people sometimes do. They get emotional. The chimp takes over, and if you've got a chimp in charge, then you're going to go straight to the consequences and do it badly.
Yeah. So very true. You've talked about the chimp paradox. You talked about various other things. There's no doubt about it. You are very widely read, Rob. I can just see where you're drawing on such a wealth of personal experience, and added to that, the research and the interests you keep having to keep current. What's your top book that you recommend lately that you've been reading or you think is good, and why would you recommend people listen to it?
Yeah, look, it might be a hard one for some to get to, but I'm a great believer in the neuroscience these days, because all those things we thought worked, it was a belief. I think neuroscience is really helping to prove that it actually does work. So there's a great book by an Australian called The Brain at Work, which is one way to access this. A more, from my personal interest, another way of approaching the same topic is a book by Rick Hanson, who's a neuroscientist and a Buddhist, and he calls it something like Buddha's Brain, the Practical Neuroscience. And it gives some very practical tips on how to use your brain to best effect. So there's a couple of books there which are neuroscience based. The chimp paradox is brilliant.
Yeah.
So accessible. Name your chimp is a great tip.
Mine that's right. Yeah, Peters, wasn't it? Somebody Peters. I've forgotten his first name, but
Stephen. Professor Stephen.
Yeah. Very, very good. So thank you. Brain at Work and Buddha's Brain, Practical Neuroscience. I'm with you on that. So what fun we have had. Thank you, Rob. Let's end with, would you introduce yourself again so people know who you are, your experience you've had in the past, and what you're doing now, and then your top 2-minute leadership tip?
Yes, thanks, Jonathan. So I am Rob Metcalfe. I live in Australia. I'm clearly a POM. I'm a Brit originally. Drawing on my military experience, I have been working in the world of leadership for the last 30 odd years. Currently working with the UN and other organizations around the world. My top leadership tip is to do whatever you want, but know what you're doing. I've used that in the podcast. What do I mean by that? I mean, take a pause and make your choices conscious. It may only be a 10-second pause, but experience indicates that you will be more creative, more proactive, less reactive, and the consequences will be more favorable if you do that. So there is my top tip. Do whatever you want, but know what you're doing. A quote from somebody else, which I have stolen, but I love it. Life-changing.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that, Rob. It's been fabulous having you on the Inspiring Leadership podcast. There's a wealth of experience that people can tap into. And I know I've taken a lot from this, and I'm sure many of our listeners and those watching YouTube have taken a lot away as well. So good luck with the continued work you're doing, and safe travels to Somalia.
Thank you very much indeed, Jonathan. Much appreciate it.